Love the biblical story of Elijah found in 1 Kings 19. I love this story because it's the story of a person who was truly committed to the call and the assignment that God had on his life. I love this story because it's the story of somebody who was called to confront, but to also comfort, to speak the truth of God's word to the people, even when they rejected it, even when they wouldn't accept it. I love this story because it's a story of a person in leadership, a person of authority, a person with great strength. But it's also the story of a person in the midst of his greatest victories, in the midst of killing the prophets of Baal, in the midst of raising a mother's child from the dead, in the midst of predicting the drought, the beginning and the end of the drought, in the midst of all these victories, found himself at his lowest point. A person of great strength, a person who loved God, a person on assignment for God, found himself in his moment of greatest weakness, found himself depressed and running. How in the world do you get to a point when you're having such great victories, when you're standing in a position of leadership, when you're standing in a position of authority? How in the world do you find yourself feeling tired and want to give up? How do you find yourself at that moment where you feel like you can't stand and the weight of the world is on your shoulder, the weight of everything is crashing down on you? How in the world did you get to the point where you feel like your hands are just too weak to carry anything? What do you do in those moments? I love this story of Elijah because it's not just a story for him, but this is my story. This is the story that I've lived. It's a story that I've told. It's a story that I continue to tell because I know all too well what it's like to stand in a position of leadership and lead other people, but still broken. I know what it's like to walk around and pretend like everything's fine and people ask you, are you good? Are you okay? And you smile and you nod and you say, I'm good. But all the while you're dying. I know what it's like to sit on a pew Sunday after Sunday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and literally rotting in the pew. But you would never know because I learned the art of performance, the art of pretending. Because when you stand in leadership, you lead. And leading leaders don't show weakness. Leaders aren't supposed to cry. Leaders aren't supposed to feel depressed, right? So my depression didn't start when I got into leadership. My feelings of rejection didn't start once I got into church. This stuff is things that I carried into my relationship with Christ. I remember growing up and always feeling like I didn't belong. Always dealt with this feeling of rejection, this feeling of abandonment, this feeling of loneliness, that I didn't fit. Who was I? Didn't know who I was. So I stood in leadership with that same issue, didn't know who I was. So if you came to me and told me who you thought I was, then I became that person because I had no identity. I didn't know who I was. I remember times of being home at night and crying my eyes out. And this was even in leadership. This wasn't before Christ. This was when I was standing in leadership, leading some of the greatest ministries, heading up some of the greatest programs. I remember in my bed at night crying, asking God, who am I? God, why do I feel so hurt? God, why do I feel so depressed? God, why do I feel so lonely? But I couldn't look myself in the mirror and ask myself those questions because it hurt too bad. So I got up every day, put on my leadership mask, put on my woman of God mask, and continued to lead even when I was hurting. There's this saying, and it really vexed me when I hear it, when people say you gotta learn to lead while bleeding, or you gotta learn to play hurt. And I always ask people, if we continue to lead while we're bleeding, what happens when we bleed out? They'll just get the next person to lead. When you say you have to learn to play hurt, We show more grace sometimes to those who play in basketball and football. If they get hurt in a contact sport, we allow them to rest. We allow them to take a moment. But if a person who's leading, especially in the church, say that they're hurting, why we don't allow them the grace to sit down and to rest? I had to learn how to look myself in the mirror and be honest about what I was feeling, to be honest about what I saw, to be honest about what I was thinking of myself, that I didn't feel worthy, that I didn't feel loved, that I didn't feel like I deserved to be in a position of leadership, that I didn't feel like I deserved whatever it was that God had for me. So for the person who stands in leadership, my question to you is, when you look in the mirror, is the person who is looking back the same person who, when standing up in front of others, is the same person behind closed doors? When you're standing up and you're teaching your class, when you're standing up and you're leading on your job, when you're standing up in front of your husband, in front of your wife, when you're standing up in front of your children, is that the same person as the person behind closed doors? Can you truly say that you're happy? Can you truly say that you know who you are? Can you truly say that you understand what it is you're supposed to be doing? Or are you the type of person like I was, you smiling, you pretending, you have it all together while you're in front of the crowd because you don't want to appear weak, but then get behind closed doors and you're literally a wreck? Peter Scazzaro said in his book, Emotionally Healthy Spirituality, said, it's impossible to be spiritually healthy and emotionally a mess. That's basically what he said. You can't be spiritually healthy and an emotional mess. It can't happen. And I tried to do it. Like I said before, I could preach, I could teach, I can minister to the person next to me. I could run around the church, I could shout, I could dance, but then I go home and literally cry myself to sleep at night. My pillow's so wet and soaked. And I get up, I'm changing pillowcases. Sometimes don't even want to get up. Sometimes thinking that my life before was better because I didn't want to deal with me. Because I didn't want to deal with the hurt and the person who I saw in the mirror. Because I didn't want to admit that I was lonely. Who wants to admit that they're lonely? Who wants to admit that even in a crowd of people, when people calling your name, when people cheering you on, when you have just had the greatest time in ministry, who wants to admit that you would just rather be home in your bed crying, or be home somewhere alone wishing for God to take your life? Who wants to admit that? So my question to the person who's standing in leadership is, are you being true to who you are? Are you truly okay? And if you're not okay, it's okay not to be okay. It's okay to take a moment and to rest. It's okay to take a moment and say, I can't lead right now, because you are better sitting down and strengthening yourself so you can stand later. I love the story in Elijah where it says that God told him to get up and eat. He not only told him once, he told him twice. He said, get up and eat. Because God understood that Elijah had to be strengthened and he had to be filled to continue the work that he had called him to do. If you're not filled, how in the world are you filling anybody else up? How in the world are you pouring into somebody else's cup if your cup is empty? How in the world are you ministering to somebody about their brokenness when you're still broken yourself? That's some questions I had to ask myself. And although I can admit there are times where I'm still hurting, there are times where I feel like those feelings of depression are coming back on, I can look in the mirror and say, you know what, Shonda, you are fearfully and wonderfully made. Shonda, you are loved. And I can get past those things. So for the person who is standing in leadership, my suggestion to you is to start looking in the mirror and being honest about the person that you see. If that person is hurting, admit that you're hurting. If that person needs help, admit that you need help. If that person is feeling alone, admit that you're feeling alone and know that it's okay. That you don't have to walk through and stand in a position of leadership pretending and with a mask on, because you're only hurting you. Thank you.